Kak Mira, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for another one of ADEC's webinar series. We are here today to talk about diversity and inclusivity in teaching and learning, specifically looking at remote teaching for students with disabilities. We have with us today Dr. Vilashini Somia from the Gender Studies program at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. But before I introduce our guest today, let's go and check out some important notes for a smoother webinar experience. So all of you now, I think, are joining in via Microsoft Teams live event. So please take note that your mic and your webcam are not activated. So that means that you can enjoy and relax this event and watch it hassle-free without having to worry about your microphones or your webcams. If you want to re-watch this recording later, you can click on the same link that you used to view this event live right now. So in this event, you'll be able to interact with us by typing in your comments or questions via the live event Q&A. It's in your panel on the right. So please note that there is a time lag between the time that you post your question or comment and the time that it actually appears in the chat. So please be a little patient with that. If possible, please keep your posts and your questions short and sweet. And if you can, refrain from repeating the same comment or question. But if someone else has already asked or made the same comment and you think it's a super great comment or it's the same comment or question that you have, then just give it a thumbs up. At the end of the webinar, we will have a feedback form, which we hope that you will kindly please take your QR scanner, scan it, and then fill up the very short form to tell us at ADEC whether this webinar was useful for you and how we can improve in future webinars. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Vilashini Somia. Dr. Vila, are you there?
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Dr. Vila?
Well, I'm much better now that I'm seeing you, Dr. Amira. That's for sure.
Yeah, connection is important, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, Dr. Vila, thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Vilashini Somia, who is a recently appointed lecturer at the Gender Studies program at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. She has a really great story, a really great background in terms of her academic background. She received her PhD from Singapore and US, and she's also had experience studying and also dealing with students in the United States. So Dr. Vila, maybe I can get you to introduce yourself and share with us your experiences first before we start this interview.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amira. I really appreciate that. And thank you everybody at ADEC and whoever's watching this either live or recorded in your personal devices, in your homes. My name is Vila and I'm trained as an anthropologist. I'm Sabahan. I work on irregular migrants, and no, I am not professionally trained in the field of education and disability at all. I don't have professional training when it comes to that specifically. But I think I'm in an interesting position because of certain things that sort of happened in my academic career in the time that I've been a student, which is number one, I suppose what puts me in an interesting position is that I have had the experience of teaching students with various kinds of disability, whether they've been visually impaired, whether they have a physical disability, or whether they've been on the spectrum, autistic spectrum, or they've had a learning disability. That's number one. Number two, I think what also makes this, I suppose, an interesting conversation is that I myself have also had educators who have had disabilities themselves. So I've had professors who've had learning disabilities. I've had professors who have been very open about, having to deal with physical disability as well as I've once had temporarily for a very short time visually impaired educator as well. So I think it's put me in a very interesting position. But third, and sort of to put a little bit of the cherry on top of the on top of the whipped cream is that I myself have a learning disability, which I'm very, very open about. I have dyslexia. And I think the big misconception is that people with dyslexia probably don't finish high school, or they never learn to read. But actually, the opposite is true. I suppose a lot of stereotypes exist about people with disabilities simply because that's why stereotypes thrive, right? We don't have enough information about the kind of disabilities or people who are differently abled, and I think sort of discussing that transition is very important today. So just to sort of give you an idea about where I'm coming from in terms of where this conversation is headed, is that I think my experiences with disability or people who are differently abled have been very vast, and I suppose incredibly varied. And putting my own experience into the mix sort of gives us, or will be able to sort of give us a good discussion about how to deal with it, especially now since we're all dealing with the MCO.
Thanks, Dr. Villa. Thank you so much for trusting us and sharing with us about your story. Be good to hear more about it later on. But
Sure.
If you can tell us a bit more, from your experience as a student and also as the lecturer, are there any specific tips that you can share to other lecturers on how we can be more inclusive in class for both physically disabled as well as students with learning disabilities?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Amira. Well, I'm going to take us back maybe 10 years back when I was a tutor actually at Dr. Amira's department at the Media Studies department, right? And so the story goes, in 2007, I'm offered a position as a tutor at the Media Studies department, and I'm coming in shiny, brand new, totally excited about the ways I can impart, half-baked knowledge onto students. And for the very first class that I had to tutor for was for a film writing class of sorts. And one of the key foundation to film writing is actually storyboarding, where you draw up these small little columns of how it is you envision movie scenes or television scenes actually forming. There really wasn't much of a problem to it. I'm not much of an artist, but I think anybody can sort of start storyboarding. But how do you actually explain that to 3 students who are visually impaired, who actually, then it's not possible for them to essentially finish the assignment. And this was, of course, in the, headed to the 2010s, where I think a lot of the tools that we have today were never really crafted just of yet. And it was such a challenge for me. I think the learning curve, in any situation dealing with any kind of disability, the learning curve is incredibly huge. And I took it very personally. I think that I did not know if there was ever a real way to really broach the subject, because I felt that no matter how I tried to sort of help them through the assignment, I'd be in some way or form insulting them. I felt that it was a sort of a sensitive area or a sensitive landscape that I could not get across. And I think also, I was sort of carrying a lot of my own personal sensitivities into the work as well. I think it took me over a decade to be very introspective about the entire experience. Because the truth is, I think the first and foremost was that there needs to be a sort of way to really acknowledge and recognize disability in a way that is dignified and respectful, but and it can have some element of lightheartedness. As the years went by, I think, I served as a tutor at the media department for 2 years. And I would safely say for all 4 semesters that I was serving, there was always a visually impaired student. And I think this is the thing about, UM students, yeah? You wouldn't think that we'd have an avenue to sort of support that, but we actually do. And actually, the truth is, when it came to my visually impaired students, I learned so much from them about being able to broach subjects about what they cannot do or what they can do differently. And I think that's a very important sort of mindset to put ourselves into. Some of the earlier discussions that I've had with visually impaired students, when it finally got into the groove of things, was that, are you disabled or are you differently abled? And I think the truth is it's a spectrum. On one hand, it's recognizing that they don't have a certain ability that some of us do. And I think that's where the term disabled really does come from. And I think to some extent, they've embraced that. There is a need to embrace the fact that they are disabled. But the process now is to also get them to recognize that they are also differently abled, that they have a set of skills and ability that other people who are how do I say, who have a standard set of abilities do not have, right? And so how they are differently abled is that they're able to pick up certain things in sound editing that a standard abled individual may not. That they may envision certain movements in ways that could solve a practical problem when it comes to production, for example. And I think that element of recognition and having that conversation very openly was very, very important. So that would be in regards to students that I have thought who were visually impaired. When I was in America for several years as well, later on, carrying on my my graduate degree, I also had the opportunity to teach people who were physically disabled, of who had muscular issues, or who were born with certain conditions that made it very difficult for them to sort of participate physically for things. If there was a field trip, then you would have to think differently about it because insurance comes into play, so on and so forth. I think that the to some degree, teaching in an American university sort of gives you an idea about how it is space plays a very, very big role in assisting the physically disabled. And that I think American universities having sort of bridged that conversation much earlier than a lot of, say, Asian universities, having the resources to manage it, have been able to make a lot of their space disabled friendly. So if you wanted to have a class at the cinema, for example, or do something that requires something, you are then informed prior whether that place is disabled friendly, or whether something has flash photography and you really shouldn't, or you should encourage your student to maybe only join in the later half of a film screening, for example. And I think while physical disability is so much more visceral for the educator, to some degree, maybe it's a little easier, in my opinion, to sort of deal with, because the challenges are very easy to recognize. You can see it and you can sort of move past it very fast. But where I really had a problem, or at least faced a challenge when it came to students with another kind of disability, was a disability that was very similar to mine. When you have a learning disability, for example, or that that there might be other things involving, say, mental health, and these certainly are conversations that I was not able to learn or pick up until I had to be thrown into a situation. In Singapore, I had two students, one on the spectrum, one on the autistic spectrum, who was trained by their life coaches to immediately tell me that that they were on the what they used to call Asperger's. I'm not sure if that term is still valid today. And I had another student who was much more severely dyslexic than I am. And I think what I found very comforting at that moment was that the students themselves took it upon themselves to tell me directly that I have this condition and I need you to be very mindful of how it is the class can progress with my condition in mind. I think coming back to Malaysia, really taking a lot of these experiences to heart. I've become very, very mindful, I suppose, and very sensitive in the classroom. Because when I was an undergrad, number one, I felt for the longest time that something was wrong, but I didn't have the language to articulate it. How do you explain that you can't tell the difference from left or right, or sometimes some of the numbers don't make sense? Till today, I struggle with reading, which is why I don't read. So I have it better. It's easier for me to have a conversation without thinking about words, if that makes any sense. And I can't spell. So, autocorrect is very, very important, or it can be the bane of my existence. But unlike many other people who maybe found out about their learning disabilities much sooner in life. I was only able to have a glimpse of my disability into my mid-20s. So I think, in a sense, when I finally knew and I finally had confirmation of sorts that I was dyslexic, there was a lot of closure, I think, and it was a bit comforting, because then I knew I wasn't crazy or insane or just problematic, or there was something wrong with my brain. It's just that I'm hardwired to look at things completely different, right? There are days that some of the words don't make any sense, and it requires me to take a step back from text or literature, which can be incredibly daunting. But that being said, because I was incredibly lucky to meet people to help me get in that direction, I bear in mind that a lot of our students don't have that luxury. And what if you come from families that don't necessarily recognize a learning disability, that, maybe you've been told that you were malas your whole life, or, you needed to buck up. And for that reason, I try to make that a practice in my physical class every day. I try to make that a point when I'm speaking to my students, that if there is any problem, if you have any of these, if you realize you're having these problems, you need to come to me. I may not be able to help you, on a medical level, but certainly it's a conversation that's waiting to be had. Now, of course, everything that I've said so far is in reference to us as educators teaching in classes on the physical. And of course, a lot can change when it starts to become virtual. And therein lies a new challenge for those of us with students with different disabilities. I'm going to stop unless in the event Dr. Amira may have a question or a follow-up of sorts.
Okay, thanks, Bila. Thanks for sharing all of that. Actually, you really hit the nail, I think, when you said that, teaching is actually, it's a challenging vocation. And now that we as lecturers, we now have to teach online, so that's doubly challenging. So for those lecturers who may also be suffering from learning disabilities or physical disabilities or psychological anxiety and stress, it can be a triple challenge. So you add all of that, and on top of it, if you have a disabled student in your class, how do you then ensure that that disabled student in your class, that differently abled student in your class, is not left behind simply because we are trying so hard, just struggling to cope with just the regular students? And how do we make sure that the disabled students following the class virtually or remotely are not left behind, that they can still keep up with our classes? Do you have any tips?
Sure. I think, with the way the semester is currently going, there's a little bit of an overlap. We started the semester in our physical classes, of course. Every semester, we are encouraged to try out an online week, an e-learning week, so that in the event something horrible happens, then we'll be ready to go. And of course, the worst has hit to some extent. Corona shock has sort of pushed us all into our homes, forcing us to conduct classes in the remote, like we're doing right now. How this semester will differ from the next semester is that, at the very least, we've had an opportunity to interact with our students in physical form for 4 weeks at least. I mean, a month, a little under a month, we've had the opportunity to talk to them. So in a sense, that relationship is bridged. Where it will really sort of test the bounds of what we can do or what we should do as educators is when the following semester comes, when it is completely online, when we would never have had a chance unless we had Zoom, putting aside this issue of the digital divide as well, where we have to communicate with all our students virtually. Everything has to be done virtually, and this may, to some degree, sort of dehumanize or make impersonal the relationships that we foster, because they're all really new, evolving grounds. It's a scenario where we're learning a lot. And I think the first step for anything is that if we had been rather subtle about our sort of embracing of these disabilities, I think we have to amp up these approaches at this point. We have to make very clear to these students that are coming in that, hi, I recognize that there are amongst us with XYZ, potentially XYZ problems, and if you have it, you need to come to me. We need to discuss how it is that I can help you. And I think it's very important to have those channels open. There needs to be an effort, I believe, from all educators to really embrace that. And while I agree with you, educators are not robots, we're not superheroes, we're everyday people trying to live our lives, trying to make sense of things that is happening in the world around us. I believe that there's a real cathartic value to be able to do that. If you can embrace and you can help students who've come to you to seek pupillage, who've come to you to seek education, then at the very least, you started this chain of reaction of very slowly but surely changing the mindset of the stigma or stereotypes that come with various types of disabilities. And as somebody with a kind of disability, I can tell you for sure that that's very important, because empowering starts by acknowledging. I think the second thing is that we also have to understand that no one disability is identical to the other. You may have 3 visually impaired students in class, but they could all have various degrees of visual impairment. One could have 50% sight, while another person could have a different set of sensory on one side of their faces, which means that their needs varies. But I think when we sort of put it put the cards out that way, it can sound daunting. It sounds as if, the responsibility is entirely mine. And I think educators in university need to understand that it's not that at all. We're not here to teach them how to live their lives every day and how to wash the dishes. We're here to sort of like fine-tune what they can already do so well. So in regards to the class education, it's about using what it is that they have that is different to sort of assist or work towards coming up with newer pedagogy, for example, or trying to put that into place. An example would be if you had dyslexic students and you're teaching them a very text-heavy course, there are tools online to help all dyslexic people read better. One example would be something called Dyslexie font, right? A specific font that is made free for students who are dyslexic or, with a kind of dyslexia who cannot read. Or if your expectation is that they have to spend so much time on the phone doing their WhatsApps and so on and so forth, sometimes that can be really tiring. It can be very draining. The fatigue is rather extreme if you're dyslexic, because you can't keep up with the way your classmates are replying to something on WhatsApp. And a simple change of the font can make reading so much more easier and so much less daunting. For example, if you have students who are, say, on the spectrum, it has a lot to do with, some sort of pastoral care in the delivery of the method. I think a lot of times the way universities are set up or classes are set up is that it's very time specific. You have 50 minutes to get through your tutorials. You have 50 minutes to make a point clear. It's almost as if it's a race, but the truth is it isn't, and it shouldn't be. So I think if you do have students who are on some form of the spectrum, who may have ADHD or something like that, it's about short bursts of information that secures a foundation. You may want to teach them that A equals to 5, and the entire process will take you on an average day in face-to-face classes 2 hours. But it doesn't need to take exactly 2 hours a day. It could be short bursts that lasts for a day. And it can be short bursts that even last for a week, because I think that element of racing through the syllabus also needs to change to a certain degree. And their classmates should also participate if it means that classes need to have an element of being able to breathe. You need a break in between things. Classes need to be short bursts of 5-minute conversations. These are things that we have to, consider. And it can make the same amount of information, the same amount of teaching and the lesson load similar to that of a face-to-face. It's just that you do it differently, right? And I think for students who are visually impaired, a lot of it is about describing. I remember a long time ago, there was a website, and I'll try to find a link and put it in, where there's a group of volunteers who will just describe anything on the internet, whether you're buying Lazada or whether you're watching YouTube, a silent movie, a description of a new design. It's just that at the very best that somebody can is to give a description about something. And I think describing it is very important. Podcasting can be a new solution as well, right? I believe Spotify has now opened its doors to help educators put up Spotify webinars or lectures, so that if students needed a student Spotify account, they just log on to it and they can listen to it on the go. They can listen to conversations, they can listen to thoughts, so on and so forth. So I think there are many ways to really, utilize the digital realm to really assist with it. But most importantly, it's about expanding our concept of time, because if somebody needs a lot of time to get the assignment done, just as long as they get it done or they attempt it is good enough. I think because we've been trained to teach, we've been trained to talk about higher education in the face-to-face, giving a big lecture in a hall, for example, that when you sort of take it away or take it a step back, I think it makes it very difficult to grasp. And so essentially the delivery needs to change. Sorry, Mira. Yeah, Dr. Amira, I can't hear you.
Okay, thank you. I muted and then I unmuted myself again.
No
Sorry
worries.
about that. I've just been taking notes, and from what I'm gathering from you is that if you were to break this down into steps, for example, so I guess would it be correct if we summarize it as step one, the lecturers or we have to reach out and connect to find out who has disabilities and to be mindful of that disability? And then, is that right? And then step two, as you mentioned just now, is to look at the pedagogy of how we deliver our classes. And you talked a lot about micro teaching, basically, teaching with short bursts, like teaching little bits of information or little bits of knowledge rather than cramping a whole lot, like cramping a whole chapter. Maybe you teach sections of a chapter. Would that be right? Yeah. Right. And you also mentioned the use of teaching aids. And today, actually living in the digital networked age, there are a lot of digital aids that you can find, like what you mentioned just now, the dyslexic font. So I'm going to check that out as well.
Sure.
And you also, third, mentioned accommodations, that basically you just have to accommodate the needs of your students, like describing what's going on for visually impaired students, maybe doing podcasts rather than video lectures. So I'm just wondering now, based on these kind of like three things that we can do to help students with disabilities in the classroom. Yeah. This is actually things that the individual lecturer has to do. So it's upon that individual lecturer. Is there anything what can the individual lecturer do so that they don't feel overwhelmed in supporting these disabled students? How can we get the individual lecturer to get help to galvanize students and colleagues in the department to also support them teaching their disabled students?
Thanks for that, Dr. Amira. I mean, I kind of just stepped back into UM like 5 minutes ago, so it might be a little bit rich coming from me. But I think if we could sort of envision a system in which we are able to openly discuss disability, not just from students but also from fellow colleagues, I think it would then create a sort of a culture of acknowledgement that is pretty much missing, I think, in many avenues of education, and not just education. A lot of, I'm sure, even in corporate Malaysia or in other avenues as well, there is a need for us to recognize that disability doesn't mean incapable. It doesn't mean not being able to do. It doesn't mean you're going to be left behind. It certainly shouldn't mean that you're useless, because that's not true. We've had incredibly successful people with disabilities around the world do so much and contribute an incredible amount of things to society. And it's a sense of empowerment. I think it's trying to find a culture of empowerment that works for everyone, and that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And I hate to use the term weak, but weak in this sense here is somebody who isn't empowered, not because they have a disability. If we don't recognize that somebody needs a helping hand in understanding a particular scientific formula, or an idea from, say, taking a page out of Foucault or McLuhan or so on and so forth, it doesn't mean you're stupid, because fully able-bodied individuals will also reach a point where they may have a problem with understanding certain things by way of theories and concepts, and even these approaches. It's not what you're learning, it's how you're learning, and it's not what you're teaching, it's how you're teaching. I think the truth is, in my opinion, or at least from my experiences, acknowledging and recognizing and having a conversation about how you can accommodate actually makes the class load so much easier. You're not adding to what you already have. You take what you have and you sort of transform it so that it fits everyone. And I think that's the question we have to ask. If there is somebody in the class who's struggling to understand, not because they don't deserve to be there. Every student deserves to be in the class, right? Every student deserves to be at the university. It's just that they take their cake differently. And that if I'm not providing you the right utensils to eat your cake, then I'm not the best host. I'm not playing host at all. And by right, I don't think it takes away from the one size fits all as well. I think there's another size that can fit all. It's just that we've got to move with the time. So I in my opinion, and I've been overwhelmed. I understand that. I completely understand that. And it isn't wrong to also feel overwhelmed, but I think that the onus is on the educator to sort of take a step back and say, this needs to be dealt with. I need to accommodate for the person who needs, a bit more pastoral help or some assistance or other. And that also needs to be applied to the rest of the students who can follow. And this doesn't discount the value of what I'm teaching, because essentially you're just saying, you're still going to learn X, but I'm just going to give you X a little differently.
You raise really important points about how we're actually delivering up the teaching to students in a way that is actually palatable to them, in a way that they can actually understand and consume that teaching. And before we started this webinar interview, what we actually had been talking a little bit about on WhatsApp, about how it's likely that those of you who are watching right now, basically we're probably preaching to the already converted, to people who actually care about disability, to people who actually have students who are disabled, and you want to ensure that you can help those students. That's why you're actually spending this time watching this webinar right now. But as there's a question actually that's just come in. I think it's a very important question. For those of us already here, we are at the very least aware, even if we don't really have the skills yet. But at least we're aware and we know to look out and be mindful for disabilities in our classrooms. But how do we create more awareness among educators to be more sensitive towards disabilities?
Yeah, Dr. Amira, I think we had this conversation a while back, right? And I don't know whether there's been attempts to sort of push the conversation further out into public discourse, at least within the boundaries of UM, at least, that it's not just students who are disabled. We probably have many staff, both academic, non-academic, who have different forms of abilities as well. And it's just that we sort of pretend like we can sort of make do with it, right? And I think that needs to end. It might have been a practice in the 90s and maybe in the early millennium, but certainly in 2020, heading into 2030, where you're dealing with an entirely new generation that goes to Twitter if they feel about a particular way, that shares their information and their feelings in a particular way, that it's a call to be mindful. It's a call to be sensitive without losing our true selves. It's not about if we refuse to change because it impacts our identity and our culture and our traditions, that's one thing, but I don't think it's that at all. And I think it has to start by us, and I don't know whether it could be something that ADAC does, or something that a collective group of people at tries to do at some point, but there needs to be open conversations about it between those with disabilities at first, and then later on those without disabilities trying to listen to those with disabilities talk about these things. I don't know whether we have enough, say, forums or engagements where we call everybody in, and there's a very strong shaming mechanism as well that's still sort of lingering, I think, in the background somewhere, simply because we don't want to be associated with the word disabled. It's a dirty word. It reduces a particular person's value. How can you have a disability when you're at university? And if you made it through all odds and you're there, then we exoticize you. You're that person with a disability with a degree, and it really shouldn't be that at all, right? These are people who've worked very hard to make it to the university. They've worked, they've put their all to either be a student or an educator or even a support staff to contribute to the university, to contribute to essentially this idea of the greater intellectualism, and that concept of degrading and shaming has no place, I think, in 2020 Malaysia and University of Malaya. It really shouldn't be that at all. So I think, if anything, it has to start by having this conversation, which is why, on a personal level, I do as much as possible to tell people that I am dyslexic. And a lot of times when I do tell people that I'm dyslexic, the first thing I'm met with is, no, you're not. That's a lie. People with dyslexia don't finish high school. They can't even write their own names. And this is true to some degree because they were never empowered or they didn't have the right sort of support. You could say the same about women 100 years ago. A woman in university? That's not even possible, right? Or what about a person who was not white, an individual of color? And an African American getting a degree? That's not even possible. These things are essentially thresholds that we have to cross. And so I do my part by telling people that I do have that disability. I recognize it. It may not come across to you back then, but God only knows the kind of challenges that I've had to face on a personal level. And what I'm trying to say is, it's not that I'm special, it's that I got lucky. I got incredibly lucky because somebody decided to help me, which means it's incredibly possible for it to happen to so many other people. So I think it needs to start there, if anything. It really needs to be at a point where, do you have a disability? All right, I recognize that. I acknowledge that. Everybody knows this. How can we accommodate it, and how can we move along? Because you're expected to pass this class, just the same as your able-bodied classmate.
I think the question for many lecturers would be, how do I accommodate this differently abled student in a way that doesn't overburden me? Like, if I had a blind student, am I going to have to write and type out and describe all the images that I put in my PowerPoint presentations? If I have a deaf student, am I not going to be able to give an online lecture or give a video lecture? Do I have to type out my entire lecture for the deaf student? So what would you recommend for lecturers who are actually facing this overwhelm?
Well, I know for visually impaired or blind students, we do have a unit that essentially caters to students with disability in UM, if I'm not mistaken. They are the unit that is responsible for brailing. That means when a student does their final exam, they take their answers that's written out in Braille and they transform it to written text for the lecturer. And this was a practice that became pretty much commonplace when I was a tutor at the media department. But I also recognize that because structurally the university is not disabled friendly, a lot of students ended up going to places like the media department because it's on the first floor, it's easy to access. If it were if they had hopes of maybe joining classes that were a little more difficult to reach, physically difficult to reach, you find that they're few and far between in that sense, simply because I think physically the university has not been certified disabled friendly just yet. And I think these are things that UM has to put its all into ensuring it achieves. It has to become disabled friendly in the very near future, because again, it's a no-no if we're unable to do that. That's number one. Number two, like I said, there are units that essentially assist with us. I never felt by the time I had finished my tenure as a tutor at the media department, it stopped being a hindrance. It really wasn't a hindrance anymore because it became my normal. And it became the system's normal, right? You just, okay, all right, this person cannot see. I know exactly what resources to turn to and how. And I think that's just what, like I said, the learning curve is great, but when you get past it, it starts to become second nature to some degree. If we have the resources to really assist with that, then it's not going to be as problematic as people sort of envision that it is, right? And you know, it's the good old saying, kalau belum kenal maka belum cinta, you know, and I think there's a lot of relevance and a lot of truth to that, because I didn't feel it was a hindrance by the time we were done with it. Certainly the professors who had visually impaired students who, again, teaching filmmaking or, you know, teaching new media at that time in the early 2000s, by the time the class is done, your visually impaired student totally got it. They may not be able to see what the interface looks like, but they totally get it because it's conceptual. And I think at the core of it, that's what you want them to know. You want them to pick up these terminologies. You want them to pick up these ideas so that they're not in the dark. Pun non-intended. So what I'm saying is there are currently these resources and infrastructures that have provided some sort of assistance, I think, so far. But we don't have enough of them, or we don't have them enough because, you know, it's a chicken and egg situation. The units won't expand because we don't have that many disabled students, but we don't have that many disabled students because the unit isn't as big, you know. I think it's about accommodating so and so. So I think one needs to sort of bloat for the other to sort of be more accommodating in that sense.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Vila. Before we say our goodbyes and before we tune off, I would like to ask you if you could share a couple of, maybe from your own experience, if you can remember specifically, what did you do in the classroom when you had to teach something visual to a visually impaired student?
I'm going to go back to finally getting a grasp of teaching storyboarding to a visually impaired student, which for me was the biggest challenge because essentially you're asking that the assignment was always year in, year out, draw a storyboard and and submit that storyboard for, you know, for an advertisement. It always came down to that. And if you expect a visually impaired student to do that all on their own, it's impossible. However, before I get to that class, let me remind you that one of the winners of MasterChef America in 2017 was blind. Okay, the winner of MasterChef America was a blind woman. I think her name was Christine or something like that. She was an Asian American woman. And the point that I'm trying to make here is there is a very important term here, which could be a way that we sort of solve, you know, the income problem in the university as well, is that paid student helpers. Visually impaired students are able to participate in classes that requires you to do something that a visually impaired person cannot if there are student helpers. Somebody who comes in for a certain amount of time, they are able to get paid. Now, of course, the student helpers that came to help the visually impaired students in their class were in nowhere paid. But in America, for example, a lot of these systems are actually paid. If you need a job, your job is to help a disabled student get through, say, look for books in the library when they're not physically able to finish up an assignment when they cannot, to become an anxiety assistant when you are on the spectrum, or you have ADHD, or you have an anxiety problem. And these sort of things sort of help empower and again normalize these conditions. And I think hopefully if one day if there's an opportunity to sort of request for UM to embrace this would be a really good way to sort of to help students and educators change their mindset about things, because it means getting your hand sort of messy with scenarios. Anyway, visually impaired students, I think 2 of them, by the time I was about to finish my position as tutor at UM, were one of the higher acing students in that particular class, simply because they were able to describe in great detail how they envisioned this. And the student sort of drew out a storyboard to say, well, this person does this. And of course, I think educators just have to learn to accept where it is that, student helpers can come in and fill in that gap. For students who are visually impaired, for students who are physically disabled. If you can't use your hand, if you have a muscular problem, for example, then a student helper comes in and is very valuable at that time, because then there's an exchange here. They are able to come on board and say, well, how do you want to draw this particular thing? Well, I envision the girl standing and her hair is blowing in the wind. Fine, I'll draw that out for you. I may not be the best artist, but it gets the point across. And I think that essentially was how it worked. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of our visually impaired students went off to do very good things with their lives, right? They went off themselves to be educators in schools for the blind throughout Malaysia. They themselves, went off to live very dignified, very healthy, very satisfying lives, and they've been all the better for it. So I think it's really trying to help as much as possible these students achieve their greatest potential, because the onus is on us to do that. We have it good. We're people at a university. We're in the, we're in a sense, we're servicing the intellectual sector of the country. So at the very least, it really should be our responsibility to look at things that way. There are ways to do things without burdening the system, internal and external. And I think it's just about sort of thinking creatively around it.
Yeah, and I think what you said at the very beginning of this was that being mindful, noticing and finding out who needs like accommodations and who needs assistance is probably the first step, I guess, towards being. Yeah. And once you know what the issue is, then you can probably be more creative to find solutions for it. Right? Yes,
absolutely. Yeah. I think, it just starts by asking, hey, does anybody need help? You come to me and you tell me, because I can help you. Or if I can't, I'll find a way to help you. And I think students, people want to hear that. You do. You want to hear that. You want to feel comforted that somebody can. And you may not have the solutions, and that's not the exercise. You're not supposed to be Mr. Know-it-all or Miss Know-it-all. That's really not what it's about. But it's about having the heart to sort of reach out to say, okay, yeah, we'll figure it out together. It isn't perfect, but at least something. And I think that value of trust is very important.
I think we're very lucky, Dr. Visha, that you've come back to UM, and hopefully you'll be able to influence and to open minds around among colleagues and students, so that more people will be more aware and more mindful about differently abled students.
Well, we try, or, when it doesn't work, then we'll just listen to Britney Spears or the Foo Fighters or something.
Well, there's a will, there's a way, right? So,
I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Visha, for this time that you spend with us and educating and opening up our minds about disability or differently abled students, and hopefully giving us a little bit of hope that, we can actually assist them, or we can actually, if we can't find solutions for them, we can at least give them the hope that, and the knowledge that we do care and that we are trying to help them, make sure they aren't left behind.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for helping me. I think you guys at EDAC are doing a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Visha, for that. Dr. Vila, for that. Yes. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us and joining our interview with Dr. Vila. Before we head off and say our goodbyes, please do note that we have a feedback form that we'd like to request everyone to fill up. You can take a picture, a screen pic of the link for the feedback form, or you can also just use your QR scanner and scan the QR code. If you missed the first part of this interview, you can view the recording of it by using the same link that you used to get into this live event. And just to let you know, we have a couple more webinars focusing on diversity and inclusivity and no student left behind. So the next one will be coming up on Friday, where we'll be talking about compassionate and inclusive teaching during this e-learning emergency remote teaching time. So we'll be talking to two lecturers. One is the director of Chitra, Dr. Wendy Yee, and another is Dr. Rusaslina from the Gender Studies program as well at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So both of them will be coming on Friday in the afternoon, so do join us for that. And on Monday, the 11th of May, we'll be speaking to the Disability Support Unit from the Counseling and Psychological section of the Student Affairs Division. And during that talk, we'll be learning about some of the upcoming new SOPs for disability and teaching students with disabilities. And we'll learn also a little bit about some of the supports and the accommodations that University of Malaya actually provides for disabled students. So we hope we'll see you again soon on Friday and on Monday. And until then, I hope you have a good week teaching. Happy Buka Puasa to my Muslim colleagues, and I hope you have a nice dinner with family for all the rest of us. So we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum and goodbye.